right. So, what would you say to the person? I'm going to play devil's advocate because
Okay.
this is not a question I would ask. I don't think. But what would you say to the person who would say that since these composers were writing white music, why do we need to know about them? Why shouldn't we just focus on the authentically black music?
Because the composers still get stereotyped that way. Um, I've
Right,
been
and I've already made clear I don't consider classical music to be a skin color. I think it's its own genre, that's its own thing. But
mhm.
I feel like there's a lot more and more over the last 10 years this desire to keep cultures and their music and art separate. And
You know. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, like cultural appropriation is the term that comes to my mind. Is that is like that's super hot right now. Is to talk about which cultures are appropriating which cultures, and and I think about like I was at our when you were giving the session, I was trying to think about music that I would consider idiomatically white, and I
Mm.
immediately came up with cowboy songs, like I don't mean
Yeah.
country music. I mean like the old cowboy songs. I went with my family this summer to a chuck wagon dinner out in Arizona in the desert,
Okay.
and right, and I'm sitting there looking around. It was actually about a week after your session. We went on vacation, and I was sitting there looking around, going, "Okay, this is what white music is. It, like this is the whitest music. Like I could teach somebody with dark skin to play those songs, but
Yeah.
it would be. I mean, but I also grew up going to those chuck wagon things with my grandparents. Like I got it. Like I understood the culture. Like it
Yeah.
was there. And whereas I could take maybe 1% of the people that were there at that thing and give them classical music lessons, and most of them would have no idea what they're like. They wouldn't know or care.
Right. Yeah.
And so to me, that's classical music for me is something that a very small sliver of the population of any skin color gets or cares about or understands. So I'm kind of against any kind of trying to divide up our tiny little culture that as I see it, I see classical music already as a tiny little subsection of people.
It is. Unfortunately, because of people's ideas that certain people are better than others, and certain things are only reserved for certain groups of people. Um, it has been the trend for the longest time that white people have been in charge of classical music.
Hmm.
There, I can't think of the name of the orchestra. It starts with like a CH, like maybe Chinike. Um, but they are an all black orchestra that played at the BBC Proms just a couple years ago, and the orchestra was started because that conductor and others said, I can look at an orchestra, and too many times I'll never see anybody that looks like me. I've gone to many orchestral concerts where nobody looked like me.
Hmm.
There may have been two people in the audience who looked like me. And so, unfortunately, if you don't see people who look like you may not be able to think that it's something that you can do. Case in point, when Jason Ferdinand was talking about his students and how so many of them, because they had not seen anybody doing what they now do,
Hmm.
it was almost like, yeah, this is not a possibility for me. And so, it's one of the reasons why I say when people choose to teach this music to their students, or even when they're teaching their audiences, it's important for people to see what the composers look like, and not just the people that are not white, but show everybody so that folks know. Um, Whether it's something that they would expect or they wouldn't expect. I heard a story about Adolphus Hailstork being at a performance of one of his pieces, and it didn't sound black, so nobody was looking for a black guy to stand up.
Right.
Um, I remember taking my black choir to a white church, and the woman saying, "Oh, I can't wait for y'all to do some of that rousing gospel music." And I'm like, I only taught my choir one gospel piece.
Hmm.
And my students, there were a couple of them who had said early on, like, "Why don't you teach us more gospel?" And I'm like, y'all already do that stuff. The classical stuff is the stuff you don't know how to do. That's why I'm teaching you this. And that was stuff they loved more. Anyway, they were just curious as to why they didn't do it more. My students, like, they actually, within a year, they much preferred much more preferred the classical pieces. I had a student who we didn't rehearse Randall Thompson's Hallelujah for like 2 weeks, and he like almost had a heart attack because he just loved that piece so much.
Mhm.
Another student who had only sung in her middle school choir, her favorite piece, her nickname was Dieu qui l'a fait me regarder, because she just loved that piece by Debussy. Like every time we were around, she wanted to sing that. But unfortunately, even for them, for my students then, they didn't have anybody who did classical music, so they never saw it. Is classical music necessarily a white thing? A lot of people that I know would say that it still is,
So
because there's still a lot of times where there just is not enough diversity and that kind of stuff, and it's just a historical thing. I mean, I don't think that I. I mean, what is white music in totality? Just like what is black music? You know,
right,
like when you mention cowboy music, we're thinking that's white American music.
right,
White
yeah.
folks, in Ireland, yeah, they're not going to consider that.
Right. Well, and here's how I would push back on that then, is I would say that I absolutely agree with everything you just said about historical representation within classical music being primarily white. Absolutely, I'm not going to argue that. That is that would be very strange and difficult to argue with actually. Um, but so that's not my point. But what I would say is that that is a criticism of the people that have orchestrated, no pun intended, the classical music over the time. The fault doesn't lie in the music itself.
That's very true.
Okay, so here, what I mean by
That's
that,
very true.
yeah, what I mean by that is let's not blame the music that
Yeah,
or the processes of learning the music that were necessary to have classical music exist. And like I said earlier, classical music, the way I think of it is I tie the word classical to classical education, which is
right.
that you, in order to get good at it, you have to have a teacher pupil interaction, and there has to be a technique, and there has to be it is a different function than folk or indigenous music styles